The tools were already outside. It was the third week of October in 1956, and the morning had come in gray and close over Maury County, Tennessee. The way it does in that part of the state, when the season is turning and the light hasn't decided what it wants to be yet. The air smelled of iron and wood smoke, and the particular damp of old brick that has been standing since before anyone alive can remember. The tools were stacked against the curb on Depot Street in Columbia. An anvil, 2 leg vices, a post drill with a cracked housing, a wooden crate of hammerheads and tong sets and swage blocks wrapped in burlap, going soft at the edges in the mist, a roll of bellows leather leaning against the fire brick from a forge that had been torn out of a wall. The man who owned them was sitting on the anvil. His name was Elmore Deeds. He was 67 years old and had worked iron in that building for 38 years. 38 years in the same 1,200-square-foot shop at the end of the same brick building on the same corner of Depot Street, with the same coal bin out back and the same hand-lettered sign above the door that he had painted himself in the spring of 1921, when he was 29 years old, and the paint was still bright enough to read from the other side of the street. The sign was still up there. But the lock on the door was new, and it wasn't his. A man named Raymond Alder had owned the building since 1948. He had bought the whole block in a quiet transaction that Elmore hadn't known about until it was done, and had raised the lease 12% a year for 3 consecutive years, and had been patient about it, the way a man is patient when he knows the arithmetic is working in his direction. The notice of non-renewal had come in August by certified letter, in language that was clear and orderly, and gave Elmore 60 days to vacate. The 60 days had ended the previous Friday. Raymond Alder was not on Depot Street that morning. He had a man for this kind of thing. The man for this kind of thing had changed the lock at 7:15 and handed Elmore the paperwork and driven away before 8 o'clock. He had been courteous about it. He had helped Elmore carry the leg vises out. It was 9:40 in the morning. Elmore had been sitting on his anvil for an hour and 45 minutes. He was not waiting for anything in particular. There was nowhere specific to go. His wife, Ruth, had passed in the spring of 1952, and his one son, Gerald, had taken a job with a road grading crew out of Chattanooga and was somewhere in the eastern part of the state. The shop had been everything. Not because Elmore had no other life, but because for 38 years the shop had been the shape of the days, and without it the days had no shape. And he was 67 years old, and the morning was cold, and the anvil was wet under him, and he had not eaten breakfast. He sat with his hands between his knees and looked at the crate of hammerheads. A man in a work shirt with the sleeves rolled past the elbow and a tan Stetson with trail dust on the brim came out of the hardware store 2 doors down, carrying a length of chain and a box of staples. He stopped on the sidewalk when he saw the tools. He stood there a moment. Then he put the chain and the staples down on the lip of the hardware store window and walked over. Here is the story. Elmore Deeds had taken the lease on the Depot Street shop in 1918, the year he came back from France, at 26 years old, with a shrapnel scar along his left forearm and the kind of steadiness that comes to men who have been in loud places and found their way back to quiet ones. He had paid every month's rent on time for 38 years. There was not a single month in that record that was not accounted for. What kept the shop alive through the 1940s and into the 1950s was the quality of what he made. He was not a production smith. Gates, hinges, hardware for courthouses and the better houses in the county, the kind of ironwork that looks like it grew there rather than being fastened on, andirons for mantels that people drove from Nashville to commission, a set of interior stair railings for a historic property in Franklin that were still there, and would be there long after everyone who remembered Elmore was gone. He had never advertised. He had never needed to. After Ruth died, he had kept the shop open 6 days a week, because the shop was where he knew how to be. He came in at 6 and left at 5, and ate his lunch at the bench with a thermos of coffee and a ham biscuit from the diner 2 blocks over. And he did the work, and that had been enough. Raymond Alder had a development plan for the whole block. The brick building would be re-tenanted with a dry goods retailer and a small loan office, and a real estate firm already lined up and waiting. Elmore's shop was the last holdout. Not because Elmore had fought it. He had received the certified letter, read it twice, folded it on the kitchen table, and gone to bed. He had not called a lawyer. He had not called his son. He had spent 60 days finishing the commissions he had outstanding. A set of window hardware for a church in Pulaski, and 3 pairs of andirons for a house in Spring Hill. And packed his tools and paid his final month to Raymond Alder's man, and been out by Friday evening, with an hour of daylight left. He had arranged for the anvil to be moved to the street by a boy from the feed store. He had no truck. He had no plan for the anvil. He was sitting on it when the man in the Stetson came over. The man crouched down on his heels to be at eye level with the crate of hammerheads. He looked at the tools the way a man looks at something he understands. He looked at the post drill and the leg vises and the bellows leather. He looked at the hand stamp marks on the hammer handles, each one a small E in the head of the wood, the way Elmore had marked his tools for 30 years so they would know their way back to him if they wandered. He looked up at Elmore. "How long?" he said. 38 years, Elmore said. Same corner. The man was quiet for a moment. He looked at the new lock on the door. He looked at the sign above it, the hand-lettered one, still legible from across the street. "Where are you taking them?" he said. Elmore told him he didn't have that figured out yet. The man nodded once. He stood up. He looked down Depot Street in both directions the way a man looks when he is working out a problem that has a solution, not a man who is deciding whether the problem is solvable. "Is the forge gone?" he said. Elmore told him the fire brick was in the crate. The fire pot was cracked but serviceable. The bellows leather was new, put in last winter. The man looked at the building 2 doors down from the hardware store. It had been empty since spring, a former feed and seed with a wide double door and a concrete floor and a loading bay in the back that backed onto an alley. Elmore had looked at it himself, 2 months before, when he still had 2 months left to look at things. "Who owns that one?" the man said. Elmore told him. A man named Bert Cassidy ran a small regional lending operation out of an office on the square. He had owned the feed building since 1951 and had not found a tenant for it at the rate he was asking. It was asking too much, which everyone on Depot Street knew, including probably Bert Cassidy. The man in the Stetson picked up the chain and the staples from the hardware store ledge and handed them to the hardware store clerk who had been standing in the doorway. "I'll come back for those," he said. He walked up Depot Street toward the square. He was gone for 40 minutes. Bert Cassidy ran his lending office out of a second-floor room above the Columbia Savings and Loan on the north side of the courthouse square. He was a deliberate man with a yellow legal pad and a habit of writing down numbers while he talked. And he had been asking $42 a month for the feed building for 2.5 years. The man who came up his stairs and knocked on his open door that morning was not the kind of man Bert Cassidy expected to see at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday, and Bert Cassidy wrote nothing down during the conversation, because the conversation moved faster than the legal pad required. The rate he had been asking was $42. What was agreed was $28 a month, prepaid 6 months in advance, with an option to continue at the same rate for 2 years. The prepayment was $168. The man in the Stetson counted it from a fold of bills in his shirt pocket onto Bert Cassidy's desk, in 20s and 10s, and waited while Bert wrote out the receipt. "The lease goes in the name of Elmore Deeds," he said. Bert Cassidy wrote the name, "and the sign above the door on Depot Street belongs to him," he said. "You'll ask Alder to take it down and have it ready." Bert said that the sign was Raymond Alder's property with the building. The man looked at him. "It's got the man's name on it," he said. "Have it ready." He took the receipt and walked back down the stairs. He came back to Depot Street with the receipt in his hand and held it out to Elmore without explaining what it was. Elmore looked at it. He looked at it again. His eyes moved over the address, the feed building 2 doors down, and the figure and his own name in Bert Cassidy's handwriting. He looked up. "I don't have $168, he said. "I know it," the man said. "It isn't a loan." Elmore started to speak. "I've been moving around the South for 3 months, and my boots have been giving me grief the whole time, and I should have had them seen to in June, and I didn't." He looked down at the boots. They were brown leather, deeply creased at the ankle, trail dust worked into every seam. "I need a man who knows what he's doing to look at them. You're going to fix my boots. That'll cover it." Elmore looked at the boots. He looked at the receipt. "That doesn't come close to covering it," he said. "You let me worry about the arithmetic," the man said. "The lease is paid. The space is yours for 6 months. The option holds for 2 years. He picked up one end of the wooden crate. "Show me where the loading bay is," he said. They moved the tools in 2 hours. The anvil required a come-along and a plank, and the help of the hardware store clerk, who had been watching from the doorway since the man in the Stetson had returned, and who turned out to have a strong back and no particular objections to using it. When the last of the fire brick was stacked inside the double doors and Elmore was standing in the middle of the concrete floor with his hands at his sides, looking at the dimensions of the space, wider than the old shop, higher ceilinged, the loading bay workable for large pieces, the man leaned in the doorway. "The sign comes down this week," he said. "Alder's man will deliver it." Elmore had his hand on the post drill. He was quiet for a while. "You've put me back in business," he said. The man said he had a pair of boots that needed work and had been making him miserable for 3 months, and that was the beginning and end of it. He picked up his hat from the top of the anvil where he had set it. He put it on. Elmore's mouth moved once. Nothing came out. He tried again. "At least tell me who I'm thanking," he said. The man told him. Elmore Deeds stood in the middle of the concrete floor of the feed building on Depot Street in Columbia, Tennessee, with a receipt for 6 months' prepaid lease in his hand, and did not say anything for a long time. The double doors were open, and the gray October light came in across the floor and lay against the side of the anvil, and the morning smelled of iron and old brick, and something that was not quite coal smoke, but was close to it. Elmore Deeds opened the new shop in November of 1956. He set the hand-lettered sign above the double doors when it arrived from Raymond Alder's man, who delivered it without explanation on a Thursday morning. On the first day, he made a set of hinges for a cabinet maker on the other side of the square, just to have iron in the fire again. Just to hear the hammer ring. He worked that shop for 9 more years. He was 76 when he finally handed the keys to his son Gerald, who had come back from road grading in 1959 and learned the trade at his father's bench, wrong for 2 years and then right for the rest of his life. Gerald ran the Deeds shop until 1991, 35 years. The same kind of work, gates and hardware and railings and andirons, the iron that looks like it was always there. He taught his own daughter, Karen, at the same bench. She had a better eye for the fine work than either of them, Gerald always said. She still runs the shop. In 1991, When Gerald handed Karen the keys, he found the original receipt in the back of the cash drawer. Bert Cassidy's handwriting. The address. The figure, Elmore Deeds, in ink gone brown at the edges. Gerald framed it that winter and hung it above the bench where his father had stood. It is still there. The afternoon light comes through the south-facing window and touches the frame for about an hour in the middle of the day, and then moves on, and the receipt stays in its place above the bench in the quiet of the shop, the ink holding its own against the years. John Wayne never told anyone, not the crew waiting back at the location outside Nashville, not his director, not in any letter, not in any interview, not in anything he put on paper in the years that came after. He came back to set that afternoon and said he'd been sorting out a supplies question and had lost the morning. And nobody pressed him on it. And that was all. There are men who do a thing and need the doing known. And there are men who do a thing because the thing needs doing, and the knowing is beside the point. A man sits on his own anvil on a wet October morning with 38 years behind him and nowhere particular to go. Most rooms look at that man and look away, because looking costs something, and most people are already carrying what they can carry. It takes a particular kind of man to put down what he's holding and walk over and crouch down and ask how long. That is the whole of it. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There are more stories like this one, and every one of them deserves to be told. And unfortunately, they don't make men like John Wayne anymore.